Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
They continue the indigenous curriculum. So there is a slight tweaking of the indigenous curriculum. For example, in Kannada schools, the indigenous schools use Shabdamani Darpana, which was the grammar book. But what the colonial administration did was that it split the Shabdamani Darpana. It brought out an abridged version for primary schools, and it used the actual text Shabdamani Darpana for high school. So that kind of tweaking did happen, but nonetheless it was entirely based on the indigenous curriculum.
It is generally believed that the indigenous vernacular education in India was oral, controlled by certain sections of the population, and exclusive in nature. However, the archival data of 16,000 indigenous vernacular schools gives a very different picture. In 1813, the British Parliament earmarked 1 lakh rupees a year for education in India. The colonial government did not utilize the amount. The British Liberals collected the data on indigenous schools to urge the colonial government to spend on improving these schools. The data is diverse and covers the Madras, Bombay, and Bengal presidencies and northwestern provinces. It comprises 9 linguistic groups: Bengali, Gujarati, Hindi, Kannada, Marathi, Malayalam, Odia, Tamil, and Telugu. It was collected between 1819 and 1838 by British officials and civilians proficient in local vernaculars. William Adam, a Sanskrit and Bengali scholar, collected the data for Bengal and Bihar. He sat in the classrooms and observed the method of teaching. So we have first-hand information on classroom practices of both Sanskrit and Bengali schools of Bengal. Many Sanskrit Pandits continued to correspond with Adam in Sanskrit long after the data collection was over. A.D. Campbell, who collected the data for the Ballari district, was proficient in both Kannada and Telugu languages. This episode of BIC Talks by Dr. Parimala V. Rao, historian and professor of History of Education, Jawaharlal Nehru University, covers access, curriculum, textbooks, school holidays, fees charged by the teachers, and the colonial policy towards them. This talk also addresses how education became exclusive by the end of the 19th century. And now, over to Dr. Rao.
Today I'll be talking about the indigenous education in India, the indigenous schools. These are not colonial schools, these are indigenous schools that existed. I will talk a little about the Sanskrit schools, and I will also talk largely about the indigenous vernacular schools, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, and so on and so forth. And the area I'll be covering is only British India, the princely states. We had 500 plus princely states, so we do not have data on these areas. So I'll be talking only about the British India. What do we know about the indigenous education? Many people have written, and there are various kinds of imaginations, and most widely understood imagination, or rather something that is there out in the public domain, is that it was oral. All transmission of knowledge in the Hindu tradition was oral, and it was controlled by the Brahmins, the one section of the society. And it was conducted, they were informal schools. It was conducted under trees, and teachers were members of the village community and received remuneration in kind, like potters and other the occupational castes. And it was destroyed by the British. My fundamental question is, India has produced 500 texts, 1 lakh inscriptions, and 12 widely used script, and how can an oral tradition create this? It's a myth that came into existence during freedom movement. A myth was created for a particular reason. So that has become fact. Sometimes politicians talk about certain myths, and then that becomes the fact. But what exactly was in oral tradition? Only 4 Vedas were taught in oral tradition. The rest of 496 texts were used. They were the manuscripts, the palm leaf manuscripts were used for teaching these texts. So like when you compare that, the written tradition was predominant and not the oral tradition. Even when the boys particularly, I mean, when the boys studied Vedas, they were already proficient in Sanskrit language as well as literature. They knew the literacy, they already had the literacy. So when was the data collected? It was not collected by colonial state per se. It was collected by a bunch of liberal British officers, and most of them were Scots. Why did they collect it? They specially collected, see, for example, in 1813 renewal of the Charter Act, 1 lakh rupees was earmarked by the British Parliament. But colonial state did not want to use it. Using that money to encourage or discourage or whatever the indigenous education, they thought it is a way of interfering in the internal affairs of the Hindu society, which they did not want to do. So these liberals, they wanted the colonial state to use this money for education. And their argument was essentially, firstly, and they had witnessed, for example, Charles Grant and others had witnessed the massive Bengal famine of 1768, where 10 million people died. Now there is a difference of opinion among the historians. Some say 2 million, some say 5 million, some say 10 million. But the exact numbers we do not know, but the largest, the number is about 10 million. So they said that the education is best defense against natural calamities. So an educated peasant will be able to defend his interest, and the whole list they give, he'll be able to, instead of cultivating rice, he will be, which is water intensive, he'll be able to cultivate, fruits, and he'll be able to export the fruits and so on and so forth. The whole list of reasons they give. The second reason was that it will stop superstitious practices like sati in female infanticide. And finally, they wanted to give a say in the administration, Indians a say in the administration. So this is why the data was collected. In fact, most of the data was collected by the Scots, whether it is Thomas Munro as a governor of Madras Presidency or William Adam as a friend of Ram Mohan Roy who went around collecting the data. They were all Scots. So we have data of 16,000 indigenous schools. We have data of several districts which cannot be tabulated. For example, Evan Bailey in North Konkan, he says 380 boys are there in Thana, in all schools in Thana. They come equally from Brahmin, Prabhu, Sutar, Bhandari, and even coolies. Brahmins and, like Prabhu, the upper caste non-Brahmin. Sutar is a carpenter. And Bhandari is a toddy tapper. So that means the lowest of the OBC students were also there, and even the coolies. So without complete information, it is difficult to tabulate the data. So the earliest data, this is a very fascinating data. British conquer Western India in 1818. And they sent out Thomas Best Jervis, who was a statistician and who was also proficient in Marathi. Thomas Best Jervis and his brother George Jervis, they were born in India. And, they were very proficient in the language because he wanted to translate algebra into Marathi. But he died early, and his older brother, George Jervis, translated it. The first, Marathi textbook on algebra called Bijaganit was done by his older brother. He was basically sent to, collect the, information about the number of villages, number of roads, rivers, basically to tax the population. But he was interested in education. He went and sat in every school, and he collected the data. So we know the name of every teacher, every Marathi teacher in the district because of Jervis' interest. And he was also the first to establish a teacher training institution in Ratnagiri district in 1820. So we have 33 Brahmin teachers, 40 upper caste non-Brahmin teachers, and 9 artisanal, from artisanal caste, what we today call OBC. And out of 82 Hindu teachers, this is the list. And then we have 2 Muslim and 2 Jewish. These are Marathi schools. These are not madrasas. The Muslim teachers are teaching the Marathi schools. Does it mean to say that these 33 Brahmin teachers were teaching these 567 Brahmin students? It was not the case. The village Pant, Baji Pant Marathe, is a Brahmin teacher. He taught 1 Brahmin, 6 Sonar, 1 Shimpi, 10 Bhandari, 4 Sali, 3 Mali, 6 Khatri, and 1 Marathi Khatris are OBCs. They are not upper caste. So 1 Panchal Bai in a shed that belonged to a Teli. We have another village, Pali, Amrutrao Bhagwant. He's a Prabhu. He taught 5 Brahmin, 6 Prabhu, 7 Sonar, 5 Kasar. Kasar is coppersmith. 4 Maratha, 5 Shimpi. You see the list of students, and this was an inclusive classroom. And, were these inclusive classrooms limited to Ratnagiri district? No, they were not. So I have given 2 examples of, Gujarati speaking and Kannada speaking districts. You look at the statistics. The majority of students in these 4 districts were non-Brahmins. In fact, Veeragram with 140 villages does not even have a single Brahmin student. Was it limited to only Western India, Bombay Presidency? No. Look at the data for teachers in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. This is both Bengali speaking and Hindi speaking. In South Bihar, which consisted of about 7-8 districts, like South Bihar has been divided into 7-8 districts now. There is not a single Brahmin teacher. So the majority of the teachers and students, 256 Brahmin students in South Bihar were studying under non-Brahmin teachers. Out of 24,318, you find only 5,744 Brahmin students. So predominant, and this is a fact because they are the majority, the non-Brahmins are the majority. So obviously in any school, in any part of India, they would be, large, they would be there in large numbers. Now, 1,470 teachers, we find Kayasthas 1,019, Brahmin 208, artisanal caste 118, Dalit 17. And again, William Adam, who collected data, William Adam was a Sanskrit scholar. And he also knew Bengali very well. So he, collected the data. He says, parents of good caste do not hesitate to send their children to schools conducted by teachers of an inferior caste or even of a different religion. It is true of Chandal and other low caste teachers enumerated. In one particular village, village Upar Bazar in Nator, Rajshahi district, Nabakishore Das, he's a Dalit. He was teaching in a school established by Govindapal, who was an upper caste Mahajan, in a Chandi Mandap where the worship was, taking place. The priest was a Brahmin, obviously. So the worship was taking place. So the kind of, the caste animosity that we see, it comes towards the end, towards the end of 19th century. So this is the caste-wise list of students in indigenous schools and missionary schools. When the missionary schools were established, they do not move to the missionary schools. They continue to remain in the indigenous schools. Does it mean to say that there was no discrimination? We do not know, but at least it is not recorded. Because William Adam went and sat in the classrooms and observed teaching, we do not. He has written, and many others also have written, that they sat on separate mats. But except that, we do not find any kind of discrimination. So now let us come to the Madras Presidency. We have data of 11,000 schools. The largest chunk of schools data we get here, 11,619. These are all single teacher schools. All the schools that I talked today, they are all of single teacher schools. We have 30,479 Brahmin, the Vaishya, Shudra, all other castes. This is a very interesting thing. These are not Shudras, they are lower than the Shudras. Then who are they? We can safely say that they are Dalits and other castes which, the definition is little difficult. For example, shepherds, where do you put today in they come under OBC, but many a time they lived on the margins of the society. So they also probably belong to this. So we have, out of 1,42,369 Hindu students, we have 1,11,890 non-Brahmin students. So in Northwestern Province, only 8 districts were under the British control. And these were Agra, Aligarh, Bareilly, Etawah, Farrukhabad, Mainpuri and Mathura, because rest of area was controlled by the Mughal emperor who was still on the throne, and eastern UP was controlled by Nawab of Awadh, and even in the rest of the area, in between area, there were small Nawabs like Nawab of Rampur and others. So what was exactly under the British control was 50 towns and 14,987 villages. So we have 27,853 boys. We have, and there were no schools in 12,987 villages. So among the Hindu teachers, 46.4 were Kayasthas, 43% 9 Brahmins, and this is the only area where you find large number of Brahmin teachers. UP and Telugu speaking area, Andhra Pradesh, that's coastal Andhra, which was under the British administration, and also parts of Gujarat. These are the three areas where you find large number of Brahmin teachers. So this is out of 21,342 Hindu students, 6,614 were Brahmins, 10,429 non-Brahmin upper caste, and 4,299 lower caste boys. There were no separate girls' schools in South India. Girls went to the same school where the boys were taught. So in a way, they were co-educational schools. In Punjab, there were women teachers and girls' schools. Except these two areas, you do not find girls in any school in any other part of India, either in Bombay Presidency or Bengal. Now, coming to the Sanskrit schools, this is very interesting. We find, two kinds of schools in Bengal, that is, they were together called tolls, that is the schools that taught grammar and Sanskrit language and some, the subjects that were exclusive, something like Vedas or, Nyaya or Dharmashastra or any of these, But rest of India, the same teacher taught language, grammar, and one of the, the disciplines there. So that is the difference between the two. And then there were considerable number of non-Brahmin Sanskrit teachers in Bengal, North India, Kerala, and most of them belong to Vaidya, Kayastha, Ahir, and several Shudra castes. Rest of India, that is, the Tamil-speaking areas and Marathi-speaking areas, all teachers of Sanskrit were Brahmins. So this is an interesting data we have for Kerala. This is the northern part of Kerala, which was under the British administration. Look at the number of boys and girls. Even girls are there in Sanskrit schools. Only Vedas, only Brahmin boys and girls. Jyotishya, Shudra boys, Shudra girls, all other caste boys, 490. They are the maximum number of students in these, schools that taught Jyotishya. Nyaya, Ayurveda. Ayurveda, you even find 4 Muslim students studying Ayurveda. Metaphysics, when the enumerators talk about metaphysics, I really do not know. I think it could be philosophy. Now, the number of Sanskrit, tolls and pathshalas, we generally assume, places like Tanjavur, which was a sacred city, it must have had large number of Sanskrit schools. But interestingly, it is Rajahmundry which had the largest number of schools. Something that we do not expect it, And Bardhaman was next, and Coimbatore was, comes later. So this also gives us an interesting data. Sanskrit was not taught as a subject, but Amarakosha was taught, which is, half of Amarakosha is Sanskrit. Okay, so that way the students had the link from their language to Sanskrit, but Sanskrit exclusively was not taught. So what do we see in all India pattern in vernacular schools? These are Tamil, Marathi, Gujarati, Kannada, and Malayalam schools. 70 to 75% non-Brahmin students and teachers, more than 35% were from artisanal caste, or what we today call OBC caste. Majority of teachers came from Kayastha, Vaidya, Lingayat, and Pillai caste. Most of the teachers in Tamil-speaking area, they come from Pillai caste. Andhra and Gujarat were, where majority of teachers were Brahmins, and Brahmin students studying under non-Brahmin teacher was common. There was no such ban on anything, And schools were conducted in temples, sheds, and houses of rich persons, and there was no dedicated building, and they were not certainly conducted under trees. I'll just tell you why. The average number per school normally varied between 8 to 25. There was a school in Konkan, that is Ratnagiri district, which had only 2 students. And there was a large, school in Kaira district in Gujarat, which had 150 students. And it was managed by brothers. Now, school timings. These were not informal school. Whenever the teacher called, they would go and, listen to some stories. No, they functioned 12 hours a day. The school would start at 6 or 7 a.m. in the morning, depending on the sunrise, and would work till 9 or 10 a.m. And again, they had a second session, 1 hour break and second session, and again a 1 hour break and a third session. And they functioned on the basis of lunar, month of 30 days. And schools had holidays on full moon, new moon, Ekadashi, Dwadashi, as well as all important festivals. Now, what was the curriculum? This is where I found extremely interesting, because India was politically fragmented in the early part of 19th century, late 18th century onwards. But all vernacular schools, whether you take Hindi, the northernmost part of Bihar, to the southernmost part of India, that is Malayalam schools, you find vernacular translation of Ramayana and Mahabharata. And Amarakosha was taught, Panchatantra was taught, and Hitopadesha was also taught. So there was no break between the Sanskrit knowledge and the regional knowledge. For example, in Karnataka, where the schools which taught Someshwara Shataka also taught Panchatantra and Hitopadesha. So, the Kannada literature was also linked to that existed in Sanskrit, Sanskrit literature. In Madras, the Tirukural was, commonly taught across the board, across all the schools. Letters and petitions of locality, letter writing was taught. Arithmetic up to long division, to cast up accounts, and to draw out bills of exchange. This is not just addition and subtraction. It's much higher than this. Village accounts were taught. So all schools taught composition, grammar, literature, arithmetic, and so on. The most interesting thing is writing petitions. If you go to any archives, you will find thousands of petitions written by Indians. Each year, petitions are filed. The files are this big. Like 1,200 pages or 1,400 pages. And they complain, they talk, they thank, the local administration, and they are extremely, they give complete information. So most of the petitions that I looked at belong to the schools. We have, for example, there is a very interesting petition. One of the oldest petitions that I came across. British conquer Western India in 1818, and 1820 there is a petition, September 5th it was written by Syed Badruddin Panwalkar and Balaji Krishna Kulkarni, and they say that they have already an English medium school, and the teacher is of Maratha caste, and we have so many students and they belong to these castes, and they request Elphinstone, the governor of Bombay Presidency, to give salary to this teacher. They say that we are not able to give salary. Why they are not able to give salary? The reason is that it is an agrarian economy. You get income only end of the year when the harvesting season happens. So they cannot give monthly salary to the teacher. So they request the government. So all these petitions contain enormous amount of information, and one can write history on that. So the father's punishment was very severe. In fact, all the people who collected the data request the government to stop this amount of punishment. Punishment was very severe. It also shows that the schools were not casual, because parents would monitor. The mothers who would not go to school actually catch hold of the teacher on the there are many autobiographies written by the people who went to these indigenous schools. Lal Bihari Day is one person. He's written a biography, and he says that when my father went to the school and inquired, it was okay. But the day my mother met the teacher, and the teacher said that, he's not doing well, that day I would get the thrashing that, I dreaded that day, he says. So even mothers were invested in children's education. Children began school at, between 5 and 6 years and completed by the time they were 13, 14. Nobody failed. This is one of the fantastic features of the indigenous school, is that nobody failed. Bright children took about 4 years, average children took about 6 years, and below average, children took about 8 years to complete the course of instruction. Writing was taught on the very first day. They used sandboards. Sandboards are an amount of sand which was put in front of every child. And the child would start tracing the alphabet and write small words. In fact, this was actually told to me by my father in his village in Anantapur district. He said that there was a Hanuman temple, and they would put an amount of sand in front of them, and the teacher is a Muslim teacher who would come to teach Telugu, English, and basic science, maths and basic science, and he would show us how to draw on the sand and then write short words. And once they progressed to the sentences, once the children started writing the sentences, then they would go to wooden boards. And when my father told me this story long back, and I asked him one simple question, Anantapur is not on the coastal region. How did you get the sand? He said, we got the sand from the riverbed. And the wooden boards were, the calico cloth was dipped in rice starch several times, and like finally it was dipped in charcoal solution, and it was fixed to a board. Roughly it was about 1.5 feet to 2 feet, 1.5 feet width and a 2 feet length, and the boys carried. This is a sample manuscript I am showing. This was not a textbook in the classroom. This manuscript is in UTC archives in Bangalore. So just to give an idea of what kind of palm leaf manuscripts were used. So soapstone sticks were used. They were called batti in North India and balappai in South India. I don't know what they were called in Tamil and Malayalam, but they were used for writing on the boards. Teachers got anywhere between 1 rupee to 8 rupees. The lowest was in Talwandi district, which the teacher got 1 rupee, 2 annas. They paid anywhere between 1 to 8 annas. I hope all of you are familiar with rupee anna paisa. At least you must have heard about it. So Bihar, again, it was one of the lower side, 1 rupee, 12 anna and 9 paisa a month. Bengal, it was 3 rupees, 12 annas. Bombay, it was 6 rupees. Lahore and Kasur, 7, 8 rupees. Gujarat is interesting. The teachers did not get monthly fee. Every time a child completed an amount of learning, for example, if the child completed alphabets, the teacher would get 2 rupees. Once the child completed writing 1 to 100, the teacher would get 2 rupees. So this was a system that they followed, and they also got some gifts during Diwali, marriage, and some local produce. This was not in lieu of cash. Cash transaction was very different, and the gifts, occasional gifts, were very different. So what happened to indigenous schools during the British period? I'll just give a quick run through the number of colleges that they established. They all, were either Sanskrit colleges or Arabic colleges. Okay. So the first 10 educational institutions that the British established were either Arabic or Sanskrit colleges. But there was a lot of protest by Indians. The Indians said that we already have this knowledge, but what we want is modern knowledge. So after 1825, they stopped it because there was a massive protest by Indians. So what they did was that from 1840 onwards, they followed a policy of incorporation. By 1840, they had complete information about the indigenous schools which was under the British administration. So they started talking about setting up a national system of education for the entire country based on foundations of indigenous schools. So they adopted the school, gave 1 month teacher training, basically to maintain attendance register, prepare quarterly and annual reports, use maps and globes, etc. for teaching geography. They continued the indigenous curriculum. So there is a slight tweaking of the indigenous curriculum. For example, in Kannada schools, the indigenous schools used Shabdamani Darpana, which was the grammar book. But what the colonial administration did was that it split the Shabdamani Darpana. It brought out an abridged version for primary schools, and it used the actual text Shabdamani Darpana for high school. So that kind of tweaking did happen. But nonetheless, it was entirely based on the indigenous curriculum. They added history of India and geography, and also supplied maps, globes, blackboards, and books for the students. And by the end of 19th century, all these indigenous schools got school buildings, but not in the beginning. So they gave 5 rupees a month as a salary and pension after completing 20 years of service. So the reasons of incorporation, there are 2. First, indigenous schools gave very high quality of literacy and numeracy for the students. Boys joining high schools could master algebra and geometry. This has come from all British officers from across India. My forthcoming book, Routledge Companion to History of Education, I have discussed extensively. In fact, one full chapter I discussed the competency of Indian students, how competent they were. So the quality of education given in indigenous schools were good. So that was the reason why they adopted. The second reason was financial. Macaulay had fixed the salaries of Indian teachers at 30 rupees, and government was not ready to give that amount. So new schools means cost of new buildings, maintenance, and high salary. So what they did was that they adopted the schools and introduced history. And history gave a sense of India's grand past to the students, and geography actually helped India to form itself into the nation, linking the village to the district and district to the province and to the larger idea of India. Punjab and Bombay were the only two areas where the British established new schools. Punjab, they introduced Urdu because there was a lot of conflict between Punjabi Gurumukhi schools, or the people who were using Punjabi and Gurumukhi, and Punjabi and Hindi. The Hindus and Sikhs, there was a lot of, I wouldn't use the word conflict, but then there was a lot of, it's difficult to use terms now, like so much of identity politics is there now. So there was, conflict of interest between the two. So finally the British decided, okay, neither your language nor their language, let's introduce Urdu as a medium of instruction, which was also resisted. That is how you see lot of Arya Samaj schools that come up by the end of 19th century, by 1870s onwards. And you also find Singh Sabha schools coming up for the Sikh children and so on. So that was one reason. But the worst educational policy was in Bombay. Elphinstone rejected even the poor Brahmins as teachers. In fact, I have written extensively in my book, how the first batch of teachers were, selected, and they were all poor Brahmins. And he was so angry, and she shouted at the chief secretary and saying that, why have you brought these beggarly Brahmins? And they were sent back. So he personally selected landed Brahmins as teachers. So as a result, and this is the kind of Brahmin teachers that you come across in Phule's writings, who would not let the lower caste children to, get into schools. See, this is, we have just seen the Ratnagiri district data. 179 Prabhu students out of 218 upper caste students in 1820. And 1842, the number of Prabhus came down to 6, single digit. In 1820, 393 students from artisanal caste consisted of 92 Sonar, 72 Kasar and 44 Shimpi. Their numbers came down to 6, 7 and 5 in 1842. Within 22 years, the number of non-Brahmin and lower caste children come down considerably. The other artisanal caste, Mali, Teli, Sutar, Dhangar, they simply disappear from the list of students. This is also one of the reasons why there is such a rigorous non-Brahmin movement in Maharashtra. So after they started incorporating the indigenous schools, they categorized the indigenous schools into 4 categories. The stipendary pathshalas, where they gave 5 rupees, salary and pension to the teachers. Rewarded pathshalas, for example, many of the schools, indigenous schools that were in remote areas, they did not have access to teaching aid, but they were already getting 8 rupees. So they did not want to forego that. So they just told the colonial state that we want teaching aid. So they supplied teaching aid, and they were called rewarded pathshalas. Then the registered pathshalas, for example, an indigenous school near Madras or near Bombay, they were already getting higher income, and they were also able to go just into the city and then buy whatever they wanted. So they refused to, take any government aid, but then the government gave 1 rupee for submitting the data, because regularly, almost on an annual basis, the British members of parliament, they were questioning the colonial state about what it had done for education of Indians. So they wanted statistics. So finally, we have indigenous pathshalas with no connection to the government. They refused the salary because they were already earning more, and they did not want to change also. So we have 4 categories. So during Hunter Commission, the first time we come across all India data, this for the British India, we have 84,740 primary schools with 21,54,311 children. Of them, only 5,360 were established by the British. Almost 70,000 government primary schools were indigenous schools adopted by the, by the government. So you understand the enormous number of schools that the British adopted. So first they were called, they were known as indigenous schools, then they were called circle schools, because they started adopting 1 by 1 school in a circle. So they were called circle schools, then halkabandi, which also means harkal in Urdu. Village schools, pathshalas up to 1860. From 1860 onwards, they introduced 1% cess, education cess. So they came to be called, cess schools. This education cess worked this way. If a peasant was paying 100 rupees, revenue to the government, then he would have to pay 101 rupees. So that's 1% cess was introduced. The government handed over, all these schools into Indian hands when local self-government was established, district boards and municipalities were established. So from 1885 to 1950, they came to be known as board schools. So from 1950 onwards, they were called as primary and middle schools. And there's an unbroken continuity. If somebody is from a village where the indigenous school existed, and if they have studied in primary school, so there is an unbroken continuity here. So we had a wonderful system of indigenous schools, and it was nurtured by the British. But what went wrong? There are 4 important reasons that, by the end of 19th century, the schools came to be dominated by the upper caste, teachers and students. First was, government was not ready to spend money. The investment, or rather the expenditure of the government on education was 1.5% up to 1870. And it became 1% because series of famines happened in 1870. So with 1%, it was hardly, the schools could not progress. The salary of teacher was 5 rupees in 1840s when they adopted the school, and it continued to be, it was just 10 rupees in 1810. So salaries did not increase. And 1885-87, when they handed over the municipalities, to whom? To the landed gentry. And these were the people who did not want their servants to enter schools. So this was one of the reasons why, the number of lower caste students came down. And this same group was also against the entry of girls into schools. So you find lot of debates and lot of decisions taken by these municipalities. You can go to any archives in India and look at a specific municipality documents, you will find that. And it also led to the check of entry of girls and lower caste into schools. The second was the language policy. Unlike the popular understanding, British were very adamant on mother tongue education. They did not use that word mother tongue, but they said that it's vernacular education. All children should compulsorily study. So from class 1 to class 7, the schools were regional medium, Kannada medium, Tamil medium, Bengali medium, and so on. High schools were Anglo vernacular. English was a medium of instruction, and they also studied one language. But the students coming from the first generation, learners, they could not survive in the high school because no English was taught. Whereas middle class and rich children, they send their children to missionary schools and private schools. So the poor and the lower caste were left out. The third was the payment by result. This was again introduced by the British, mainly because after the incorporation of these indigenous schools, a number of schoolmasters did not improve. They would not teach, geography. They would not teach history. And geography was the main reason, they would not teach. In fact, George Campbell, who was, governor of Bengal, he traveled from Calcutta to Patna, and he entered every school that he came across on the way. And he had one question: where is Bundelkhand? Neither the teacher nor the student could answer this, including Patna school. So even the city school, they could not answer. So finally, the British decided that, something should be done. We should induce the teachers. There should be some kind of a reward for the teachers for actually teaching. So they introduced this payment by result. And this was not something that was, they did not, create this system for India. They already had used it in England. From 1855 onwards, they used this payment by result. And accordingly, the teacher would receive the salary at the end of the year, and if all students have passed. So it worked like this. Government gave 6 rupees per child if it passed. And imagine if there are 30 students and all the 30 students pass, he would get 180 rupees by the end of the year, which was around 15 rupees a month, which was reasonably all right. But if only 15 students pass, his income was lower than that of a Mali, that is gardener of that school. So imagine an illiterate gardener getting more salary than a literate teacher. So this led to 3 important reasons which we suffer even to this day. The teachers encourage first generation learners. This particular system, payment by result, was implemented in Madras Presidency. That is why by the end of 19th century, you find, large number of upper caste children in schools and, teachers also, because they would pass, only the upper caste children who already had fathers, brothers who would teach them, they would pass. Learning became exam-centric, and the system of rote learning started. And this is actually the starting point of rote learning in India. Fear and stress of examination started, a lot of pressure on students to pass rather than enjoy learning. Then the fourth reason was the political leadership. How did the political leadership operate? In 1838-39, we have seen the Bengal data. There were, Chandal and Kaibarta caste, that is Dalit caste teachers and students. 1840, government decides to assist the school. This is Radhakant Deb, who was member of the Viceroy's Executive Council. This is what he says. And interestingly, Radhakant Deb came from a Shudra caste. There is still debate in Bengal. I have spoken to many of the Bengali scholars. They still debate whether he was a Dalit or an OBC. So he also comes from an ambiguous lower caste, and he's a Sanskrit scholar. Radhakant Deb is a Sanskrit scholar. And this is what he says. Education, would wean the youth from the plough, the axe, and the loom to render them ambitious only for the clerkships. So he vehemently opposes the entry of lower caste children. So in 1870, Britain introduced compulsory education, and Governor General Mayo and Governor Campbell wanted to introduce in India. They did not call it compulsory education, they called it mass education. The entire mass of the country should be literate. Pyare Mohan Mukherjee, he says that education should not be given to poor and low caste because educated will not respect the upper caste. And we also find Syed Amir Ali. These two are members of the Viceroy's Executive Council. They are the people who, the most powerful Indians at that point of time. They are sitting every day with the Governor General. And he says that, maktabs are enough for Ajlaf Muslims, that is the lower caste Muslims. And he even questions, in Bhagalpur Jilla School, out of 120 Muslim students, only 9 are from Ashraf caste. The elite Muslims. And why government is wasting money on these students? Actually, there is a letter written by him to the Governor General. So Rajendra Lal Mitra opposes fee concession given to the poor student. He says the government cannot charge unequal amount for the same commodity. Today we talk about commodification of education. Here is an Indian leader who is talking about education as a commodity. He tells the government you can't make unequal charges for the same commodity. So by 1900, schools and colleges came to be filled with affluent upper caste students. The poor and the low caste got further marginalized. They also opposed, the same group. Pyare Mohan Mukherjee, Syed Amir Ali, Rajendra Lal Mitra, they oppose, teaching maths, science and girls to schools. Thank you.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.